Like, stop screeching about the liberals like they shouldn't exist. You need those people to keep society at least somewhat fair. And the liberals need the conservatives to keep society at least somewhat safe.
I'm honored to sit down with an extraordinary guest, Sebastian Junger.
The long-range missiles that we allowed them to use inside Russia, that is dangerous, but doing nothing could also be dangerous.
He's the acclaimed author of The Perfect Storm, Tribe, and War. Beyond his books, Sebastian is also an award-winning journalist and filmmaker. His documentaries like Restrepo and Korengal take us straight to the front lines of war, offering raw, unfiltered perspectives on the human cost of conflict.
You can either talk to them or fight them. And that's just a human truth. You're not willing to talk to someone, you may have to fight them.
But today, we're going to shift gears to a deeply personal chapter in his life. Sebastian's latest book, In My Time of Dying, recounts his harrowing near-death experience.
The really terrifying thing about death is that it can be so casual. I felt a funny pain in my abdomen. That was me starting to die.
A moment that not only brought him face-to-face with his own mortality, but profoundly transformed his outlook on life, death, and what truly matters.
I'm looking down on my family, and they're below me, and they're crying. And I said, you got to hurry. You're losing me.
Keeping it real with Jillian Michaels.
Oh, sure, yeah, whatever, yeah. Don't lose my flip phone.
Shut up!
Yeah, I've never had a smartphone. Yeah, I'm a smartphone virgin. I'm.
No, talking. Am I good?
Good? We're good.
Okay. I intended to open this asking you about whether or not you thought Tulsi Gabbard was a Russian asset, whether or not Netanyahu is guilty of war crimes, and whether or not you think Biden should be ramping up the war. But I just discovered that you... Oh, and by the way, when you died and saw your dead father hovering over you, all things I've got planned on my little note sheet here. But I noticed you had a flip phone, and I think that's going to be my first question.
I just never wanted one of those freaking things. They just look distracting and addictive, and everyone looks miserable on them and anxious, and the data are in. People are increasingly depressed and anxious, particularly teenagers, particularly teenage girls. And I just sorry, I'm good, thank you.
How are you functioning, though? Emails, text messages?
Well, I get emails on my laptop at my desk, right? I mean, only when I'm home, like we used to, like 15 years ago. And my phone can text and call. It is a phone, right? And I have a glove compartment full of maps, and I know how to orient my way around the world. The only thing I can't find out is what the traffic is, right? But I live in New York City. I don't drive that much. It doesn't matter. I'm digitally sober. That's the way I put it.
Digitally sober.
Yeah, I'm digitally sober. Social media in your front pocket all the time, 24/7 is.
You're a journalist.
It's addictive, right? No, but but you're right. But I don't want to be an addict while I'm a journalist, right? And everyone's addicted to
It's true.
And you don't need it. You don't need social media to function, right?
No,
and you make a pretty good argument that it diminishes your life. And I'm 62, and I don't want my life diminished in whatever time I have left. So sorry, I'm not buying it.
There's your flip phone. You got your flip phone back.
There it is. Yeah, you can touch it if you want.
No, that's me.
There it is. Yeah.
I didn't die.
Yeah,
I did not die.
You did not die. And
My finger didn't fall off.
You've been
This is
infected with it. You're
incredible.
going to get one.
Oh
You're going to see.
Gosh. Well, my little brother has one of those bags that you can. Have you ever seen this? You put your phone in it.
Oh yeah.
And the phone can't listen to you. It can't track you. He's 34 and I'm 50. And I'm like, Greg, is this necessary? He's like, yes, it is. Yes, it's necessary.
Tell them to buy a flip phone. It won't be necessary. The battery lasts for days. I don't even bring a charger when I travel, right? It lasts forever.
Come on.
They're $50.
Really?
Yeah. Amazing.
All right. So then back to the topics at hand. As one of the most famous journalists who have ever covered war, I mean, between your documentaries, your books, you've been on the front lines. What do you think about what's going on in the world? I know you're like, listen, I don't specialize in the Middle East. It's not that. You have a unique perspective, in my opinion, that politicians don't have. It's very easy to ramp up conflict when it's not your kid,
right,
when it's not your husband. And I'm wondering right now, Biden is pushing the up button on the situation in Russia and Ukraine. And as a mom, I'm like, yeah, I don't want this. This is not World War II. We're not fighting. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, those kinds of calculations are extremely complex, and I'm not privy to the information they have that goes into them and to the sort of 3D chess game that is geopolitics, right? I mean, but what I would say is that placing North Korean troops in Russia is to attack a sovereign country, Ukraine, is a pretty outrageous move by Putin, right? And so, in the sort of balance of world power, the idea that that kind of provocation and transgression goes unaddressed, unacknowledged, could also be extremely dangerous.
I see.
Right?
Yeah.
And what Biden. So I'm not for or against anything, right? I'm a journalist. As a friend of mine said, we don't tell people what to think. We tell people what to think about, right? So think about it.
And for me, I actually don't know. And I think many people don't know. Right. And this is why I want to hear from you.
Right. So the Putin regime, they attacked Chechnya twice, right? The world did nothing. Georgia, Transnistria, Moldova. His transgressions are in the former Soviet sphere are numerous, and the world did not do anything. Right. So it's not like we respond to the slightest provocation. It finally took an outrageous invasion of a sovereign country, a fledgling democracy, for the West to respond. And I do think democracies have to defend each other against despots, and Putin's a despot. So I just on some level, I sort of understand the reasoning. Did we make strategic mistakes that led to a situation where an invasion was possible? Yeah, I think probably. I think we probably misplayed the NATO hand, et cetera. But at the end
of what I was going to ask you.
But at the end of the day,
did we provoke it to a certain extent?
Well, it's like saying,
were there off ramps we could have taken?
I hit you because you made me angry, right? And it's like, yeah, maybe we provoked him, but he still invaded a sovereign country with a huge army and has pounded it flat with his artillery and his missiles. Like there's nothing that legitimizes that.
Okay.
Right? It's an outrage, right? So and now he's got North Korean troops in there. It's an extremely volatile, bad situation. And so doing the missiles, the long-range missiles that we allowed them to use inside Russia, that is dangerous, but doing nothing could also be dangerous, right? And you just don't know how these calculations are made. So I'm agnostic about whether it was a good or bad thing. But what I don't believe is the sort of paranoid, Biden's senile and trying to get us into World War III. I mean, it's just like that's not
making those decisions. It seems like.
We don't know, and we have no idea. Like we're not in those rooms.
I get it.
Right? We just don't know. And, I think of course he's part of those decisions. And, but also a lot of very smart people also are who don't want World War III, and neither does Putin, right? So, this is all, there's a lot of, hold me back in the bar fight, right? No one really wants to be in the bar fight, but how do you posture in such a way that you don't lose face, like you don't lose your dignity, and you don't have to get in a fight? Like how do you thread that needle? And that's a lot of geopolitics.
Having been on the front lines, first of all, what in the world made you decide to do something like that? And how did that impact you as a person? Or change your worldviews? So
I was a young man. I wanted to test myself, right? The war had affected my family a lot. My father was a refugee from 2 wars. He was born in Germany in 1923. His father was Jewish. They left in 1933 when things started to get unpleasant. They went to Spain. They left in 1936 when the fascists rose to power under Franco. And they went to France, and then they fled France when the Nazis came in, more fascists. As I like to say, my father speaks 5 languages because thanks to the fascists. Like they just chased them all over Europe, basically. They went to Portugal and then the United States. So it impacted my family a lot. And, I was about 30 years old. I was a climber for tree companies. I was a high climber. I worked 80, 90 feet in the air with a chainsaw and a rope. I'd hurt myself doing it. I wanted to be a writer. I thought about writing about dangerous jobs, and because I had one. And in the fall of 1992, my girlfriend dumped me, and I thought, I need a radical change. I'm going to go. There was a civil war in Bosnia. I'm like, I'm going to go see I'm going to go to that war and see what happens. Can I become a journalist in a war zone? Will that be the kind of crucible that I need to transform myself into that kind of professional? But also as a person, as a man, like how will I respond to that environment? Will I do okay? And a lot of young men, and maybe young women as well, I don't know, but a lot of young men are like, how would I do in a war? Like, would I measure up?
Yeah, I've asked that, and the
Yeah.
answer is no, Sebastian. I don't think I would.
Right. Well,
which is why I can't say, that it's like I don't want to ever advocate for something I don't think I would have the courage to fight or kill someone or watch my son or daughter go in and kill someone.
Right. But understand that a lot of young men do want to answer that question for themselves. How would I do?
Right.
Right. And that's partly how do I become an adult? How do I become a man in a situation where I've never been tested, never been challenged? I've never been in a situation that's out of my control where I have to show a certain amount of courage and altruism for others and et cetera. Yeah. And so off I went to the siege of Sarajevo and the meaningfulness of it, the sense of importance and gravity, like, wow, I'm part of this and I'm communicating information to the rest of the world about this tragedy. Like that was intoxicating. And I just kept going back to wars, and there were war reporters who were 10 times as experienced as me. But for whatever reason, I got a certain amount of visibility, and I did work that people responded to, like emotionally. It was meaningful. And, so here I am. I no longer cover wars. I have a family. I have 2 little girls. I wouldn't go near a war right now. But I'm awfully glad I did it. It made me who I am in some really powerful and profound ways.
Why do you think men need this kind of test?
Well, I think they get the sense that, there's this phrase, be a man about it, right?
Yeah.
Right. So people and women, many women as well, use that phrase. Like, what do they mean by that phrase?
Man up.
Man up. What do they mean, right? And what do women mean when they say man up? Like, what in society means a specific thing. And what it means is, bro, it's time for you to put yourself last. It's time for you. And, I think partly women who give birth and risk their lives giving birth almost biologically wind up putting themselves last. Like, it's sort of, it's a kind of inevitability, right? With a man, it's a choice. And if you're not mature enough and courageous enough to do what every mother has done, right, is like, put your concerns last, be willing to suffer, be willing to take a risk for other people, for this society that we're going to ask you to protect. If you're not willing to do that, you're not a man. You're just self-concerned and you're a child. So you can be a 45-year-old male and not a man, right? I would argue that there are very few 45-year-old women who are not women, who are considered girls. It's just not a category of that in our language and in our culture. But we all know the 45-year-old guys who are basically still children, right?
Oh my God,
right?
Yes.
And women don't want to marry those guys, and nor should they. And society is fed up with those guys, as we should be, right? And we need those guys doing all kinds of dangerous things. Like I can't remember the numbers, but the vast majority of workplace fatalities are male. Right? Because men do dangerous stuff that society needs done that gets them killed, right? Like 90%, something like 90% of workplace fatalities are men, right? So society needs men to step up and take on dangers that women are already facing in childbirth. The mortality rate, pre-Western medicine, but the sort of like in human terms, the mortality rate for childbirth is 1% per birth. So if you're a woman in 1600 or whatever, and you have 5 kids, you're running a 5% mortality risk, which is the equivalent of battlefield deaths for soldiers, right? So like that's why we ask men to man up and like, listen, put yourself last. If you get killed, sorry about that, but you got to do what you got to do. So when you grow up like I did in a wealthy suburb, right, where there's never a risk, never a challenge, never a danger, never even a hardship, you can grow up wondering, am I a man? And I know it's impolitic to say it that way, but just to be honest, that is the question many of us have who have grown up in situations that were not challenging. And so sometimes you have to seek those situations to demonstrate to yourself, I've got what it takes, right? And right? And it's just, that's how society works. And every society works that way. And it always has.
One of the things that has fascinated me about your book, In My Time of Dying, is we open up and you're surfing alone in really dangerous conditions in the winter on the East Coast, and you almost die. And then there's another story where you like go off on your own into the wilderness in Spain and you almost freeze to death. And then You're a war correspondent on the front lines where you could almost die. And in these moments, I'm like, this guy's like some sort of David Goggins-esque lunatic. And then you died.
Right.
In a situation that was...
That finally wasn't my fault.
Yes.
Yeah, well, listen,
Yes.
there's almost no limit to male stupidity as well, right? I mean, men die at 6 times the rate that young women do because they do take stupid risks, right, from violence and accidents, right? I think the figure is something like 85% of people who die of lightning strikes are male. Because they're out during lightning storms,
Yes.
right? It's just, and society needs risk takers as well, right? And young males are great risk takers because they kind of don't matter in some ways, right? Right. I mean, they don't matter in reproductive terms. You can kill half the men in a society, and within a generation, the population is the same, right? You kill half the women, and it cripples the population. But men are replaceable in that sense, right? Female reproduction is a very, very limited resource. Male reproduction is almost infinite, right? So you can kill many more men in a society and the population will be the same within a generation. That's not true for women, right? So if you're going to use a sex as cannon fodder, as it were, use the men, right? Do not use the women. It'll cripple your population.
You say that, and you have 2 daughters and a wife. I say that, and of course I have a daughter and a wife, but I have a son.
Yeah.
And I can't think of any war in history. I mean, maybe, I guess, World War II. In my sort of sphere of knowing, in the last 100 or so years, World War I, no shot. Fighting Hitler, I mean, oh my God, no Vietnam, no on Korea, no on Iraq.
Right.
So it's like, and he's nuts. The kid's nuts. So he's always into something. And we had a conversation recently where he was he's 12, trying to barbecue himself a steak. He wasn't with me, he was with my ex, even though she's a great mother. Lit his face on fire, burned off his eyebrows. And this is not the first time this child has almost died. And we had a conversation, and I was like, Bud, listen to me, okay? I make a lot of decisions on a daily basis because you exist. I gave up motorcycles. I did this, I did that, I did this. And I did it for you.
Right.
And I'm going to tell you right now that I'm going to need this some reciprocity here, because if you die, you're going to ruin my life.
Yeah.
It will ruin my life.
Yeah,
it will ruin mommy's life.
Yeah.
It's going to ruin lives. I need you to think this shit through.
Well, yeah, right. Yeah, and I mean, there's a balance to strike, because if he leads a completely safe life, he risks feeling not mature, not manly, not attractive to girls. Girls like risk takers. I'm sorry, they just do, right? Not all women, but men who take risks and succeed at it get a lot of female attention.
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
So
yeah.
And I have two young girls, daughters, right, 7 and 4, and I was teaching them how to rock climb. Right. My wife was very nervous about this, and she's pretty game for anything. But we were out in the woods, and I had a rope and a harness, and I was belaying them up a little, like a boulder. I mean, nothing, right? And my oldest daughter said, and my wife couldn't watch, right? I know what I'm doing. It wasn't unsafe at all, but my wife couldn't watch.
You didn't climb trees and chop them down,
Yeah.
so I think you got that.
So my daughter says, "Daddies are for adventure, and mommies are for staying alive."
Wow.
And if you get
Smart
those two
kid.
in balance, you have a relatively safe but challenging, interesting, dynamic life, right? So that's the balance that we need, and of course it doesn't, mommy and daddy doesn't have to be a man and a woman. It could be 2 men and 2 women, whatever. But those 2 roles, one which is sort of expeditionary, right, and risk taking, and one which is cautious, you have them together, they balance each other. That's why the populations in every society are almost exactly divided between liberals and conservatives. When they're both legitimate concerns. They don't work when they get out of balance with each other, but when they're nicely balanced, you have a society that functions pretty well.
Yeah.
Right? So
The extremes.
Conservative concerns are legitimate and important, right? Liberal concerns, ditto. But when one or the other runs everything, it's a disaster, right? So and there's a genetic component to political belief, right? It's adaptive. There's literally liberal and conservative genetics involved, right?
Wait,
So
elaborate. I'm sorry.
yeah,
What?
60% of the variance in political opinion is genetic, and they know this from twin studies. So they look at identical twins and fraternal twins that are raised separately, and the identical twins are far more likely to share political belief, even though they're raised in separate families, separate parts of the country, than the fraternal twins that don't share genetic material in the same way. So, but it's
Wild.
But if you think how evolution works, it reinforces adaptive behaviors. So conservative concerns are adaptive. They keep us safe in a hostile world, et cetera, et cetera. They're informed by hierarchy, by stability, all that stuff, right? Liberal concerns, ditto. They're less worried about the enemies, but they're more worried about, listen, we need equality here. We need some justice. We need a fair society, or we're going to split in half, and then both sides will be more vulnerable. So when you get the two together, it works very well. And so the idea that there's a genetic basis for these two basic worldviews makes perfect sense, and is divided 50-50 in our society, right? So when liberals say that conservatives are like shouldn't exist and blah, 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 you're wrong. This is genetically encoded, and ditto for the conservatives. Like, stop screeching about the liberals like they shouldn't exist. You need those people to keep society at least somewhat fair. And we need the liberals need the conservatives to keep society at least somewhat safe, right? And you get them together, that's how it's always worked, right?
What do you think about more people moving towards being an independent and going on a case by case,
Well,
or
those
candidate by candidate?
Those categories are a function of our political system, right? But the sort of basic liberal and conservative ethos, the basic concerns, what worries you most, right? A lot of liberals will say, what worries me most is that the country is going to fracture, is going to fall apart because of injustice and inequality and blah, 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 right? And you say to a conservative, what worries you most? And you're like, immigration, the Chinese, like whatever. And they're like, God bless everybody, right? We need both of those concerns fully developed and addressed. They're both serious threats to our country.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. I have a question specifically, and I wonder your thoughts on this. Tulsi Gabbard, I personally am a fan. I've actually never met her, but she has struck a chord for me for a few different reasons. She's a combat veteran. And she did what I have often questioned if I could do. So I admire that about her. And she came from a family that it was not okay to be gay. She's obviously not gay, but she did a complete 180 on her position about gay marriage, gay rights, and did this when her family and her religious background was rooted in that. And somehow we've forgiven the entire Democratic Party that was anti-gay marriage. It's like, oh, everybody evolved. But but now that she's, been forced onto the other side, people are trying to weaponize that against her. And she did it in a very authentic way, very early on, and struggled with going against things that were in her DNA, literally. She's turned around and tried to, as far as I can tell, explain the NATO piece of that conflict you and I were talking about, and has sat down with guys like Assad on a fact-finding mission to see what it would require to bring peace. This is out of her own mouth. It wasn't secret. Nothing was secret. And now it's like, oh, we don't do that. And here's my question. So now, tabling Tulsi Gabbard, having seen what you've seen, Reagan sat with Gorbachev. Kennedy sat with Khrushchev. Trump has sat with Kim Jong-un. What do you think about that? Because you've watched people die in these situations. Would you do anything to stop it? Or am I just kind of like the mom that doesn't want her 12-year-old going to war at any point ever over anything?
Yeah, I mean, look, Trump sat down with the Taliban and negotiated with them and negotiated a peace. Right. I mean, these are the people that supported the people who killed 3,000 people on 9/11. Right. So the truth is, in the world, like, you're going to either talk to them or fight them. And that's just a human truth. You're not willing to talk to someone, you may have to fight them. Right. So what are you going to do? I think there are people who have transgressed so grossly, so grotesquely, Hitler, that you're just, what are you going to talk about?
Right.
What middle ground are you imagining with Hitler where you can sort of live with a bit of what he's about and stop the war? Like, I don't know, I'm not there, right?
Got it.
Right?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's a continuum is what you're saying.
Right. And so, Assad's a freaking war criminal, right? But should we talk to war criminals to try to improve the lot of humans in that part of the world? If you're concerned about human suffering and if you think that conversation will help, Yeah, you might have to. People talk to war criminals all the time, right? I mean, Netanyahu has just been indicted by the ICC, right? He's been charged with being a war criminal, right? Would we talk with Netanyahu trying to promote a ceasefire deal, a peace in Gaza? Of course we would.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So, I don't know what she said to Assad. So I
literally has said a fact-finding mission, and talk to both sides, everybody involved,
I mean,
trying to figure out what it would
Right.
require for it
Right.
to end. And I know a little bit about that because I have a Syrian ancestry on my father's side. I remember these children washing up on the beach. It made me go work for the UNHCR, which the United Nations, the United Nations Refugee Agency.
Yeah.
They ended up sending me to South Sudan because they had much bigger celebrities working on Syria. They're like, we've got, Ben Stiller and Angelina Jolie over here.
Right.
If you want to go to South Sudan, I was like, all right, I'll go to South Sudan. But it's interesting because I am drawn to trying to find a path to peace always, especially when I'm not the one doing the fighting.
Right.
But you make this like a completely different perspective of being the one that was out there, being the one that would have had to go in and did risk your life to cover these stories and tell these tales and make sure the world knew what was going on and humanizing these conflicts for people so it wasn't someone else's kid dying on the other side of the world. And it's like you bring up.
I think what you do, talking to people can help, and so it should be done. But I think what we want to make sure we don't do is be an apologist for criminal behavior.
Of course, right.
Putin is a regime that has invaded and diminished border country after border country, right? Just ask the Georgians, ask the Moldovans, right? Ask the Chechens, right? This has been going on for a long time, and the West had never done anything, right? And so, yes, that might be true about NATO, and I get it. But if you look at his history, a history that the West did not respond to, right? Finally, when he says, okay, we're going to take over Ukraine, 40 million people on the border of Europe, right? That we would sort of like not respond to that isn't realistic. And even if we made some miscalculations in our strategy or did some stupid things in our strategy, at the end of the day, Putin decided to invade a fledgling democracy with 300,000 men, right? And the way those soldiers acted in Ukraine is unspeakable, right? There was mass torture and executions and all this ghastly stuff, right? So you can't, you have to acknowledge that when you talk about NATO transgressions. Yeah, we may have transgressed in our signaling, right? But we didn't invade another country with 300,000 men, right? That we didn't do that. And, the problem with some of the America's mistakes is that I think Putin could legitimately say, yes, you did. You invaded Iraq, right? So that, and I was against the Iraq war and I didn't cover it for that reason. I didn't think I could be objective, right? I don't think Putin would say that about Afghanistan. I think he probably understood. Even in Iran, apparently after 9/11, there was a moment of silence in a soccer stadium during a soccer game for the victims of 9/11 immediately after, right? And I think Iran, when we went into Afghanistan to corner and kill Al-Qaeda, I think Iran was like, yeah, we get it. Like, of course you would. Why wouldn't you? Iraq was a different matter, right? So that's I put Ukraine in that category of like, what? You invaded a sovereign country, like on a pretext? Like, come on.
Okay. Now then, we've got you in all these crazy situations that I establish. Can you tell me how you died?
So I didn't, medically, I didn't die. I was extremely close. My heart did not stop beating.
Okay.
Right? So, and even when that does, obviously, it takes a while for you to irreversibly die, right? You can be brought after, your heart stops, you can be brought back. But, so what happened was, I was a war reporter for a long time. After my friend and brother and colleague, Tim Hetherington, was killed in Libya, I stopped war reporting. And eventually I got married. I had a family. And I sort of turned towards life, right? I mean, I was like, now I'm in
So
my,
ironic. You appreciate, obviously.
yeah, no, it's right. I'm in my 50s. I'm an older dad. And this is all I want is to have a family. I slid into home base as far as I was concerned. I was almost killed several times, of course. And I was like, I'm done with that. The drama of that was an amazing way to spend 20 years. But and I'm a healthy person. I was a marathon runner when I was young. I'm not a walking heart attack. I've lived a pretty good life, medically speaking, like, whatever. I'm like, and so it was during COVID, and we were we were living in Massachusetts in a remote house at the end of a dead-end dirt road in the woods, no cell phone coverage. The landlines were old, and when it rained, they didn't work because they would short out. It was basically paradise, right? And surrounded by woods.
Flip phones on crack.
Yeah, exactly. And one day, we had a little bit of babysitting from some teenage girls who lived up the road, and my wife and I walked off into the woods down this little path to a little post and beam cabin that I'd built a couple of years earlier, overlooking this little lake. An oil lamp, totally off the grid, wood stove, like the most beautiful place in the world, right? And so because we had a couple of hours to ourselves, we walked out to this little sanctuary. And, I always thought of death as very dramatic. I've been blown up by a roadside bomb. I've had bullets hit next to my head in a sandbag. The really terrifying thing about death is that it can be so casual, so offhand, so ordinary, so mundane, right? And so in mid-sentence with my wife in the most beautiful place in the world, right, I felt a funny pain in my abdomen. That was me starting to die, right? As a healthy 58-year-old, and I didn't know, right? I was like, oh, what's that, right? And so it was sort of indigestion plus, right? I mean, it wasn't agonizing, but I was like, damn, that is weird. So I stood up to try to sort of walk it out, and the floor just went reeling away from me, and I almost fell over. And I sat back down and I said to my wife, I think I'm going to need some help. Words I never thought I'd ever have to say, right? And the problem, what was going on, I didn't know this, thank God, is that I had an undiagnosed aneurysm in my pancreatic artery, which is super rare. An aneurysm is an unnatural ballooning of the artery wall. It's not cholesterol, it's not clogged arteries. It's a totally random structural problem. It's a plumbing problem, right? And in my case, super rare. And aneurysms will grow for decades, slowly get bigger and bigger. The artery wall gets stretched and stretched. They're undetectable, usually asymptomatic. And then eventually they'll burst and you will start bleeding out into your own abdomen, right? If someone stabs you in the stomach, you know what happened, you know what's wrong, and the doctors know where to stick their finger to plug the leak. Like that's, you're doing well at that point, right? With internal hemorrhage, no one knows where it is. It could be anywhere in your abdomen, right? So I was losing a pint of blood every 10 or 15 minutes into my own abdomen, right? And I was just gushing blood internally. And there's 10 pints of blood in the human body.
I was going to ask you, I couldn't remember that.
There's 10 pints of blood in the human body, and you can lose about half before you die. And I'm losing a pint every 10 or 15 minutes, I'm guessing, right? And we live an hour from the hospital. So you can do the math. Like I was literally a human hourglass. I didn't know that, thank God. So I got my hand over my wife's shoulder. She put her arm around my waist. She dragged me out of the cabin through the woods, got me to the car in the dirt driveway, put me in the passenger seat, ran in and told the babysitters, they were like 13 and 15, right? Said, something wrong with Sebastian. Can you call 911? But the phone lines were out because it had been raining. So this girl got one bar of signal at one particular spot in the driveway. She got one bar of signal and called the ambulance. So my wife is meanwhile with me holding my hand and watching me go in and out of consciousness. And every time I sort of pass out, she thinks that's it. He's not coming back. Yeah. Then I come back and she's like, stay with me, stay with me. Eventually the ambulance got there and they took me, we started out on the long drive, and now I'm feeling a little bit better because I've gone into something called compensatory shock. Your body kind of rallies and clamps down on everything and hoards the blood that you still have in your chest, in your brain, where it's needed. And so you sort of feel a little bit better. So I'm like, damn, maybe I shouldn't go to the hospital. It's going to waste a whole day. I'm thinking like that, right? And my tummy still hurts. My tummy hurts, right? But I'm like, no, who goes to the hospital for a tummy ache. Like, come on.
You know, that's what's so crazy
Yeah.
about stuff like this is I had a back injury that was actually severe, but I was like, it was a spasmed muscle. It was like a fractured vertebrae and
Right.
3 herniated
Right.
discs, but it just, your brain doesn't put it together that it could
Right.
be something this
Right.
crazy.
And, there's a famous statistic that married men live longer than unmarried men. And this is why, right? Because it was my wife who said, he's going to the hospital.
Wow. Yeah.
Right? Don't listen to him. He's not doing well. Like, take him to the hospital. Because the paramedics, both men, were like, oh, he seems pretty good. Maybe he just dehydrated. It's a hot day. And she's like, no, take him to the hospital. I made it within 10 minutes of dying. Like, had she not done that, I'd be dead, right? So I got there. An hour later, I hold on, make it to the hospital. And as soon as I get there, I just go off a cliff medically. I go into end-stage hemorrhagic shock. I'm convulsing. I'm so hypothermic. My blood pressure is 60/40. I mean, I'm like running on fumes, right? I'm probably 10 minutes, 15 minutes from cardiac arrest and death. And they rush me. The doctors know immediately what's going on. They rush me into the trauma bay, and this doctor comes up to me with this big needle. He says, I want to insert this through your neck into your jugular to transfuse you, to give you blood.
Yep.
Right? And, it doesn't look like it's going to be a whole lot of fun to do this. And so I said, you mean in case there's an emergency? He said, this is the emergency. Like, I just did not get it. I had no idea. And so they're prepping my neck, and I'm lying in the trauma bay, and I'm lying down. And so I have to pause and say, I'm an atheist, right? And I'm not like an atheist, but kind of like mystical or spiritual. I'm none of those things. I'm nothing, right? I'm truly nothing, right? And my father, who has been dead 8 years at this point, was an atheist and a physicist. He's which is like an atheist squared, right? So I'm lying there, and all of a sudden underneath me, I sensed this black pit open up, like this portal to the abyss, right? And it's terrifying, and it's pulling me in, right? And I don't know I'm dying, but I have this animal sense, like if you go into the infinitely black pit, you're not coming out.
Yep.
Do not go in there. Do not go in there. But I'm getting pulled into it, and I'm starting to panic. And then suddenly above me, slightly to my left, and above me is my father, my dead father, in this sort of weird energy form, like his essence is right there above me, and he's communicating with me. And I'm shocked to see him, right? Like, what are you doing up there? Like, what? And he communicates to me, it's okay, you don't have to fight it, you can come with me, I'll take care of you. I'm like, go with you, you're dead. Like, I'm alive, the party's over here. Why would I want to go with you? I'm just in for belly pain. I think you got the wrong idea of what's going on here, right? And I said to the doctor, you got to hurry, I'm going.
Oh my God.
I knew I was being taken. I didn't know where, but I knew I was being taken. I wouldn't come back, right? I said, you got to hurry. You're losing me. So they brought me into the interventional radiology suite, and using catheters through your groin, you can get anywhere in your body with catheters, right, through your venous system. And interventional radiology is this sort of miracle, right? It's sort of magic. They put you on a fluoroscope, which is like real-time X-ray video, and they can thread these things through your body, and they can just maneuver them anywhere in your body, right? It's like, okay, here's a map of the interstates. Where do you want to go in the United States? Like, that's your vascular system, right? And I wasn't sedated because my vital signs were too low, so I'm conscious for all this. I'm in incredible pain. And for the next hours, they tried to save my life, and they couldn't do it. And I remember, like, at 1 a.m, and I'm in incredible pain. I remember at 1 a.m, right, like late.
What transfusions had they given you at this point? Because it was like, thank God they didn't run out of the blood. I remember this.
Eventually, it was 10 units of blood that I needed, like a full body's worth of blood, like a full oil change,
God.
basically. So late, like the early hours of that morning, 1 a.m. or something, I remember the doctor saying, well, we tried. Like, we can't do it. And what that meant, I didn't know this, but I mean, I was shocked. I mean, it was at that moment I was like, I finally got it. Like, I might die. They might not have an answer. Whatever this is, they might not have an answer for it. What that moment was if interventional radiology doesn't work, they send you into the OR and they try a last ditch attempt to save your life, which is they open up your abdomen and they start looking for the ruptured blood vessel. They push your organs aside, and they start looking for the ruptured blood vessel before you bleed out. And the outcomes are so bad. I mean, sometimes it works, but the outcomes are so bad that the doctor said we would have brought your wife in to say goodbye if we'd had to do that, right? Meanwhile, she's gotten to the hospital, right? And she was called to come to the hospital, and she knew what that meant.
Yep.
Right. But then they went through my left wrist. That somehow fixed they figured it out.
Some special guy that wasn't supposed to be there, though, right?
Yeah, Dr. Dombrowski, Phil Dombrowski.
Everyone was like, it's not going to work.
He was at the forefront of developing interventional radiology 30 years ago, and he just happens to live near the hospital where I was on Cape Cod. And they called him from dinner. He's like, Dr. Dombrowski, there's someone who needs you. He's an abdominal hemorrhage, and we need, so he drove an hour, in the evening to come save my life. And they managed to do it. And, and the next thing I know, I'm in this sort of vast darkness, and I hear this voice, a century later is what it felt like, right? I hear this voice. It's a woman speaking, and she's got a really intense Boston accent. And I'm like, where am I? Like, what is going on? And I'm in the ICU, and it's the voice of a nurse.
There was a moment that you talked about, and I think this was the dream that you had the night before this happened, where you were like over your family and they couldn't see you.
Yeah. So one of the, as I said,
it was like a foreshadowing. Forgive me. I read the book in June.
Right.
And it's December. And I didn't refresh because I wanted to kind of re-remember it as the audience was watching it. But I remember that so clearly, and it was deeply disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, it was. So for me as a rationalist, I mean, what I say in the book is the problem with rationality, which is a very powerful tool, right? The problem with rationality is that things keep happening that you can't explain. Mm-hmm. And this is one of them, right? I mean, I might be able to explain the vision of my father as a dying hallucination, whatever. That explanation has problems, but I can sort of imagine proposing that, right, and hoping that you'll buy it, right? But the dream, the predictive dream, is a different matter. And so, and this is what happened. It was 36 hours before, so it was just before dawn, on the morning prior to the day that I almost died, that I was supposed to die, really, right? And I'm there, and I'm looking down on my family. And they're below me, and they're crying about me, and I don't understand why. And I'm sort of waving my hand, I'm shouting to them. So my little girls are 3 years old and 6 months old at this point, and my wife is with, and so and I'm trying to communicate with them, like, I'm here, and they can't hear me, they can't see me, and I don't know why. And then I'm made to understand, and I'm above them, right? And then I'm made to understand that they can't hear me or see me because I'm dead, I'm a spirit, and that I'm headed out. Like, this is it. There's no going back. And the sense that I had was I was on this enormous orbit out into the darkness. And I was leaving them, like, in this orbit. And I was never coming back. Like, it was too big an orbit. I would never see them again. And it was an orbit in the sort of infinite darkness, right? And that's just what was happening. Sorry, right? And I was so racked with anguish and just remorse and like, oh my God. And I mean, and it woke me up. And suddenly I'm in the bed when we co-sleep. So with the four of us, the two girls and my wife and me, and it's just before dawn. I'm like, oh my God, thank God that was a dream, because it felt real. It felt like it was happening, right? Whew, that was a dream, thank God.
It was real.
Well, that's what's so strange about it. It was
right.
Yeah, it was predictive. And so I got quite neurotic afterwards, because I started to read a lot about NDEs, near-death experiences.
All transparency, I'm fascinated, and I've spent years reading about them.
Yeah, and I didn't know anything about them. So when I started reading about them after I came home from the hospital, and I came home very shaken up. I mean, imagine, right? But I thought the hard part's over with, right? I survived. Here I am back with my family. Why am I crying so hard? And then I started researching NDEs because I was curious about what happened, and I realized that dream. NDEs, they're not an
near-death experiences. In case anybody is not in case anybody's not just as avid of a content devourer on this topic as us at this point.
But they're not like they're not an infinite variety of NDEs, right? There's like 3 or 4 basic buckets that they fall into.
Right.
One is the dead showing up to receive the dying, which is what happened to me with my dad. And another really common form that they take is that you're hovering over your loved ones, over your body, over the doctors. You're sort of above them and going out, right? And so I researched this. I'm like, oh my God, that dream was a classic NDE, except I knew nothing about NDEs. And had someone told me about NDEs, I'd be like, oh, that's nonsense. Like, come on, don't come at me with that. That's ridiculous, right? And I had this fear. I was like, oh my God, maybe that was my experience of actually dying. Maybe I died in my—
when I read it.
Yeah, maybe I died in my sleep.
That's what I thought.
Maybe everything since then—
Or like the time being relative with the, you being related to physicists. Maybe it was a glimpse of that moment in time or something.
Or a different reality, a parallel reality. I mean, I didn't, and so I'm asking questions that in some ways sounded very flaky to me, right? But I'm like, how did I know? Like, what? And so I had this fear that that everything now was actually a dying hallucination, and I wasn't alive, right?
Yeah.
Or that there are multiple dimensions, multiple realities, and that I had actually died in a different one, and that's what that dream was.
You think so?
Well, no, I don't. These are questions I was asking myself, right? I don't think so. But what I was worried about was that there was some other reality where my wife and children were grieving me.
Yes.
And I was like, how do I get over to that reality to say to them, listen, there's another reality over here where I made it, and we're all together and we're all okay, just so that you know, right? And I just drove myself into a kind of madness around this. And so what I was experiencing is called derealization, and it's a product of trauma. It's a known thing. And a lot of people who almost die— I just talked to a guy last night. I did a reading at Vroman's, and this guy came up to me. He had a kidney transplant, and he said, this is years earlier, and he said, I still don't entirely believe that I survived. I think this all might be an illusion, right? So it's a common, after the trauma of this, it's a common terror, right? And I eventually got the help I needed and climbed out of this pit. But it was quite a pit. I mean, I was very, very neurotic, very anxious, very panicky, extremely depressed. Like I was a semi-functional person for quite a while.
Yeah, especially because it's like, as you're saying, you've got both the girls, your wife, and they're both young. And I often say this, I had a great life. I've had a great life. I'm lucky. I could go tomorrow and be super lucky. But I got to get got to get my kids.
Yeah.
Somewhat to a point where.
Yeah.
My wife's like, "What about me?" I'm like, "It'll be okay. I'll leave the house. You're young. I mean, someone else." But it's, and you go on this journey in the book researching these things. And I'll tell you, what struck me is that everything you talk about in the book are things that I had sort of investigated and looked into, and it's these. There's just a handful of these experiences, and the similarities are staggering.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, yeah, okay, so there's—
As an atheist?
Yeah.
And the son of a physicist.
So my favorite baseball team are the rationalists, right? Like every time they play, they defeat the opponent, right? I mean, I love watching the rational mind in action. It almost always wins, right? And it's a deeply satisfying process to sort of, for me to like participate in or listen to. So when I researched NDEs, there are thousands of cases of this. They're all quite similar. They're all very compelling. They all make you think, whoa, maybe there is something, maybe we don't have to worry. Like it's tempting, right? And I fell for that temptation a little bit, right? And then I read the rebuttal, the sort of rational rebuttal to all this. I was like, oh, well, like, nice try. But clearly, the neurochemistry can explain this, low blood oxygen. There's various sort of explanations involving biology and neurology. They explained an awful lot of this. The light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, people who are pilots who are put in human centrifuges to be subjected to high G forces experience exactly that, right? They don't have enough blood in their brain, and they see a light at the end of a tunnel. It's like, all right, I got it. Most of this, I feel like, can be explained through sort of rational medical terms. It's not evidence of an afterlife. It's evidence of a struggling brain that's dying, and it's going through these changes, right? I get it, right? Except for one thing, right? And so one of the important thing about skepticism and rationality is that you have to apply skepticism to skepticism. You have to apply a rational analysis to rationality, right? It should be done to itself as well, right? So for me, the thing that sticks out, and I'm agnostic on this. I'm not going to say there is or isn't anything, right? But for me, this is the question. This is the conversation. if you give a room full of people LSD, they will all hallucinate. There's no mystery why. But they don't all hallucinate the same thing, right? The strange thing about dying is that the dying see the dead. They have remarkably similar experiences on the threshold. Identical? No, but it's very, very similar.
Right.
It happens in societies all over the world, throughout history. The consistency is remarkable. And so what I don't understand, I understand you're all just saying, oh, we know why dying people hallucinate. Of course they do. The brain's under a lot of stress, et cetera. Neurotransmitters, all, stuff I don't even quite understand. What no one has explained is why they all see the dead, even dead people that they didn't know had died because the person had just died, right?
Yes, I've read two of those experiences.
Yeah. Very strange.
I feel like we should tell people this one story. So there's a researcher. I'm wondering if we're talking about the same thing. I imagine we might be because there aren't many cases of this. But there's one guy who's dedicated his life to researching this. And there was a boy in the hospital, and he has a near-death experience, and he sees one of the nurses there. And she tells him, you have to go back.
Right.
Tell my parents I love them and I'm sorry. He wakes up. Yeah. The nurse had the weekend off.
Yeah.
Her parents had given her a car for her birthday. She crashes the car and dies.
Yeah.
There was no way he could have known.
Yeah. I mean, listen, I talked to a woman who was in a coma for 4 months, and her stepfather, who she loved, who had died, came to her while she was in a coma. There's only two things she remembers. Her stepfather came to her, right? And weirdly, because she wasn't a basketball fan, Kobe Bryant came to her, right? And so when they got her out of the coma after 4 months, and she said, the only thing I remember is my stepfather. I just talked to this woman a few weeks ago. She came to a reading that I did, and she told me the story. And she said, and Kobe Bryant, of all people, like, she didn't care about Kobe Bryant. Like, and he had died while she was in a coma.
Right.
She had no idea. Right. Does that prove there's an afterlife? No. But it does raise some powerful questions. And so the rationalist response to this, to like why the dying see the dead, is like, well, clearly these people are scared. Even if they're unconscious, they're unconsciously scared. Their body knows what's happening. And they're projecting a comforting image, right, of the sort of afterlife, so that they have a receptive place to go. They're self-soothing.
Coping mechanism.
Right, exactly. But the problem with that, to be skeptical about skepticism, right? The problem with that is that if this is happening to people who are unconscious, if it's happening all over the world, people in extreme duress, you're talking about very deep structures in the brain, right? You're talking about things that are really, really hardwired and come out not because we're choosing to project, oh, I miss my girlfriend, I'm going to imagine her, right? That's a cognitive process. These are really, really deeply rooted behaviors, right? And those behaviors are a product of evolution, of natural selection. So the question would be for people proposing that, the skeptical question would be, how would that work in terms of evolution? Like, evolution rewards behaviors that either lead to reproduction, higher reproductive rates, or higher survival rates.
Right.
But we're talking about a situation where you're minutes or hours from dying, you're not going to reproduce, and you're not even going to survive. We're talking about dying here. So evolution doesn't care if you're scared when you die. It doesn't give a shit, right? Like, how would evolution shape the human brain in such a way that we unconsciously produce comforting images when there's no evolutionary reward for doing so? It doesn't work, right? So finally, for me, because the $10,000 question is, so what's going on? What's going on here, right? I don't think it's all neurochemistry, right? But I am still an atheist, and I don't believe the sort of God explanation for all this, and this sort of like cliched idea of an afterlife where we just continue on as we are, unencumbered by our bodies and by anything unpleasant. Like, I just don't believe. I don't, like, it's a fairy tale, right? But in the realm of quantum physics, there are some profound questions about the nature of consciousness, whether consciousness is collective or individual. Right?
Yes.
The very, very strange and mysterious fact that a subatomic particle can be in two places simultaneously. There are great, great mysteries in the quantum world, and not mysteries that are like spiritual and supernatural, right? These are things that you can do in the lab, and you can say, this makes no sense.
Yeah, this little particle was in, what is it, superposition? It was everywhere, all at the same time.
Right.
Until we observed it, and it collapsed into one reality.
Right.
And that's proven.
Right. And those entangled particles can communicate information faster than the speed of light.
Right.
Which should be impossible, but we've shown it to be possible, right? And we don't know why. So the book, basically, I sort of walk people through all of this stuff. And it's a short book, right? It's not a long book. It's, 100,
I've
180
got it
pages,
on
something like that.
audiobook, and you narrated me through it, and I listened to it as I was driving through Europe.
Yeah. But
it's such an awesome read. I mean, obviously, go get the book. We can't tell you everything.
Thank you.
But I was like, get me Sebastian Junger. Must speak with him.
Yeah.
Because it's so just incredibly compelling and emotional and moving and thoughtful. And I'm not letting you go just yet.
No, I'm good. I'm good, yeah.
I'm wondering, you spoke about the way your father communicated to you was almost like a transmission, like a knowing, a mind reading. And I must admit that I also grew up for years as an atheist, and I was very close with my grandmother. I lost her when I was 10 years old, and we had this pact that, like, if I can come back, I'll come back.
Right.
Years, nothing. And I was like, okay, this is just it. This is just over. It's not gonna happen. And I never even dreamed of her. Nothing. And I was like, my God, she's not even in my dreams.
Right.
27, I'm going through a really hard time. And I'm in my mom's house in a dream, following my mom down this hallway. My mom kind of peels off down this hallway. And there's a woman putting things away in my mom's room. I keep walking, and she turns around, and it's my grandmother. Sebastian, I mean, it's crystal clear. Like, I love you. But even the way she penciled on her eyebrows. Yeah. And I immediately break into tears. And she begins kind of communicating all of these different things to me, but she's not talking. Yeah. I can hear her, but she's not talking. And one of the things that I was able to hold on to when I woke up was the thing that you were trying to tell your family in the dream of, like, I know I'm, like, we see each other every day. And it wasn't, I'm always with you. It was something, and I didn't understand the potential of parallel universes at this time. It was 20, however many years ago. But it was something to the effect of, like, we're doing this all the time together.
Right.
It's okay.
But you just don't realize it. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what she meant at the time, but now.
Right. And, and there's a credible, conversation among physicists about is consciousness, which is something we can't even define, right? But it's core to our existence. Is it part of the entire physical universe the way gravity is?
Right.
Right? And does it determine the nature of the physical universe the way gravity does? Right? And it's a legitimate question. And Schrödinger, who was connected to my family in some nefarious ways a long time ago, and one of the fathers of quantum physics, his belief, for what it's worth, his opinion was that consciousness, that there was a universal consciousness that we're all a tiny bit part of. And so that might, if that's true, that when we die, our individual consciousness might return to the universal consciousness. And is that some of these weird mysteries of ghosts and telepathy and dreams and near-death experience, is it all part of one basic fact that we cannot comprehend, which is that the entire universe is connected to itself, and all of us are connected to each other and to the universe in ways that we just will never understand. But is that what's behind the veil, and we'll just never see it?
I tend to think so. And I don't know why. I can't tell if it's, but it's always felt very organic to me. I haven't done any sort of heroic dose of psychedelics yet, but I've heard this. I don't know if you have,
no.
But they'll give, researchers will give people who have terminal cancer.
Right.
Psychedelics, and it brings them some sort of peace because they feel as
they realize they're part of something. Yeah.
And it's this universal feeling.
Right. And it's the point, it's the point of religion. I mean, there's sort of loss of ego that comes with a religious revelation, with enlightenment. It all involves not a consolidation of ego, but a loss of ego. Which, I mean, you think about how important ego is in leading our lives and making things happen that we need to make happen. All this, it's our ego. I don't mean egotistical. I mean just our ego, our sort of central identity and concern. It's crucial to our survival, right? And so, why would enlightenment mean the loss of ego? That's sort of counterintuitive. But in fact, all over the world, religious epiphanies and drug trips and near-death experiences and all these extraordinary things all have this one one thing in common, which is an ecstatic loss of ego. And that is what Schrödinger, in his way, was sort of proposing about consciousness. Yeah, you die and you become part of all things, right? So if I can tell a brief anecdote.
Please.
Yeah,
Oh my God,
yeah.
please.
So it's not in the book, but I read this after I finished the book, and it's about Dostoevsky, the writer. And so when he was in his 20s, he was like a young radical, right? He had some buddies they would sit around and talk about radical things with. I think it was called the Petrevsky Circle. And among other things, liberating the serfs.
Could you imagine being a fly on that wall?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So cool.
In the 1840s, liberate the serfs. Like total heresy in Tsarist Russia, right? So eventually the Tsar was like, enough of this, and had them rounded up and arrested and thrown in prison. Him and Dostoevsky and his buddies, like six young guys in their 20s, right? And they spent 8 months in prison. And it wasn't a particularly serious crime, so they weren't particularly worried about it. Prison must have sucked, but 8 months later, they're let out of their cells, loaded into a carriage. They just assumed they were going to be driven to the courthouse and released to their families, right? And instead, they were driven to a city square, and tied to posts, and found themselves in front of a firing squad. And they had just moments to make peace with the fact they were about to die, right? They're 25, 26 years old, right? And moments to make this adjustment. And the commands were given, ready, aim. And at that moment, a rider galloped into the square and said, the Tsar forgives them. It was all theater. It was a mock execution. Incredibly cruel, right? 2 of the 6 men were insane for the rest of their lives.
Wow.
It broke them psychologically. But here's what Dostoevsky said about that moment before what he thought would be his final moment, right? Like in that, ready, aim. What's the world look like to someone in that position? And it's like a drug trip. It's a completely hallucinatory vision, right? And so what he said he saw, he said he looked out beyond the firing squad in the distance, and he saw sunlight glinting off a church steeple. And he had the thought, in moments, I'm going to become part of the sunlight. I'm going to become part of all things, right? He had the exact same vision of unity, of rejoining, of this sort of infinite expansion into the colossus of the universe. He had the exact same vision in that terrible moment that people have on drug trips and near-death experiences and religious epiphanies and all this. Finally, I'm part of everything, right? And does that show something unique about the human brain's neurology, or does it show something unique about the universe that we just don't get? I mean, I don't know.
I think it's the latter.
Well, it might be. I mean,
think it is.
Yeah.
And I think, what else was so interesting to me about In My Time of Dying is that because your family, you come from this family of physicists and your father's a genius scientist, and which has made you an atheist, because that's what intelligent people do. And I get it. But yet, I'll never forget, and I don't know if I ever misinterpreted this, but when Einstein was like, if I could just know all this stuff, then I would know the mind of God.
Right.
And that, to me, was church. It was like understanding the way this stuff works. That was my religion. And it didn't take me to a place of thinking, oh yeah, so it's all nothing. It took me to a place of thinking, it's just so big we don't get it.
Right. And when I have conversations with people who believe in God, we talk about this. I'll talk about the idea of universal consciousness, which is an idea that comes out of the work of physicists, right?
Yeah.
It's not a spiritual conversation; it's a scientific one, right? But what they will say, what one person said to me was, "Well, maybe universal consciousness is God, right?" And so my answer was like, "Well, that's a semantic battle, right? Like just changing the wording doesn't change what it is. If you want to call universal consciousness God, go ahead. That's a fine word to use, right? But it doesn't sort of get you out of the trap, right? Because like, where does God come from, or where does the universe come from?
Chicken and an egg.
Yeah, right. So call it what you want. You want to call it God, that's fine. God being different from religion, right? And religion is, has its complications and issues. The concept of God, fine, if that's your word for universal consciousness and that's what you think is going on, great. You believe in God. It's just not a choice that I make.
So after having been through everything you've been through, and again, like, forgive me for being a little woo-woo on here, but this is it's not lost on me that somebody like you has had this experience. And I remember actually listening to you talk to Rogan about it, and you're like, I am a friggin' atheist. My father was a scientist. Like, of all the people in the world to be like, you, the guy that was
Yeah.
on the front lines of war, surfing alone, and probably was a small craft warning.
Right.
Like, now it's like, no,
Yeah.
you, buddy. And you, by the way, you happen to be the perfect person to tell the story.
Let's mess with the atheist.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
And the guy who has the ability to connect all these dots intellectually, the guy who's a journalist and a storyteller, do you don't think there's something to that?
If you mean a divine hand?
Kind of.
No.
Kind of. Really?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I mean, it's a nice story. I would, in order to believe something to be true, I'd have to. Okay, this might be helpful. There's two things.
Okay.
There's stories and there's explanations. We need stories, right? We live potentially meaningless lives that end after 60 or 70 years of toil and trouble and pain. And, to do that psychologically, it's very hard. And we need stories that make us feel like it's for something, right? That there's a God, there's an afterlife, we're going to be taken care of, lead a good life, and you'll be cared for by, those are stories, right? And we need stories in order to psychologically to get through what is a tough existence for many, many people, for everyone. And then there's explanations. Why do airplanes fly, right? Not because God's hand keeps them aloft. Planes fly because there's something called an airfoil, and with enough thrust, there's lift, and et cetera, right?
Okay.
So that's an explanation. It's not a story, right? You're in the realm of explanations because you can test them, right? So gravity is an explanation for the behavior of objects, right? You can test it by throwing a rock out the window, and it will fall towards the center of the earth, right? That's how you test gravity. You're like, okay, that's an explanation. It's not a story, right? Stories cannot be tested, right? It doesn't mean that they're unnecessary or that they're not useful or helpful or beautiful, or it doesn't mean anything. It just means that they're not explanations. So when you say, was there a kind of divine hand that guided me towards this? I'm like, that's a nice story. If you want it as an explanation for how I wound up doing this, you're going to have to devise a test that will show us that is in fact what happened. What would that test look like? What would a test for God look like?
I don't think we're given those tools, because otherwise, what's the whole point? I tend to think, as I search for the meaning, that yes, I do think meaning is what you make it. You bring a meaning to a suffering and a loss and a tragedy. It's like man's search for meaning. Viktor Frankl, I get it. Something shitty happens, and you better make that meaning out of it, or die and live a devastated life. However, I can't help but think on some level, only because I think I've also experienced it at certain times of like a knowing, a calling, a voice, a feeling, a weird dream that has similarities. Your story.
Right.
Like, was it like 1 in 10,000 people have a near-death experience?
I can't remember the
Something
number,
crazy.
but yeah.
I think that you had all that information is in your book. Get it. But I don't know. I'll leave it with you here. This happened to you. How are you different because of it?
Had I seen God instead of my father, I would believe in God.
But you didn't technically die, you said.
No, but regardless, I mean, had the vision above me been a divine presence, I would be like, wow, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is a divine force in the universe. But I saw my father, right? I mean, so a human, right? Now, his appearance and certainly the dream beforehand begs some questions about if we know anything about how the universe works, which for me is a scientific question.
Yes, 100%.
It's like, right?
Yeah.
And I wasn't looking for a story about what happened to me. I was looking for an explanation about what happened to me, and one that maybe could be tested, right? So that I could trust it like I trust the theory of gravity, the law of gravity, okay? So it opened my mind to the possibility that we don't understand everything. In fact, we might understand very little of what's actually happening in the physical universe, right? But what it also did is change me emotionally. It changed me as a person, right? And what it sort of made me I mean, it's going to be so cliched, but it made me appreciative, right? I mean, life doesn't come into focus until death comes into focus. And when death comes into focus, you see life crystal clear, right? And I was an older dad. I have 2 daughters who I love above all things. I'm married to a wonderful woman. And it's possible in the frustrations of daily life to lose sight of what a miracle it is that you're living a good life, that you're with people you love, and that you exist in the first place. It's very easy to lose sight of that when you're stuck in traffic on the 405. Right? So what I've learned to do is to love the traffic on the 405 because it exists and because I exist and all of this exists. You know what I mean? Like, I've learned to do that. And I'm not Buddha, right? I mean, I'm perfectly capable of frustration and anger and all those sort of juvenile emotions that are understandable, right? But I'm able to rein them in like very, very quickly. And then the final thing, sometimes people ask me, did this experience make you less scared of death? No, it was terrifying, right? What made me less scared of death actually was something that my daughter said in the wake of all this, right? And I was sort of awake to the beauty of the world and of some of the things my children say because I'd almost died. So I'm not sensitive to this way of thinking. And so what she said, I mean, the wisdom of children, right? I mean, they see the world clearly. They see the world for what it is. Adults don't. They probably can't afford to, right? But children can, and they do, and they're a source of unbelievable wisdom because of it. And at one point, I explained to my daughter, a couple of years ago, she was, maybe 5. I explained to my older daughter how the solar system works. I said the Earth is a sphere and the sun's over here and everything. I sort of gave her the basics, right? And she's
this
like,
goes around that goes around this.
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
I'm with you.
So, she's a smart little bean, and she chewed on that for a while. And like a couple of days later, she came back and she said, "Daddy, I know why there's night." I said, "Why is there night, sweetheart?" And she said, "So other people can have day." Right? So after my heart finished melting, I thought, oh, I get it. I know why we die. So other people can live. Like the earth, the universe cannot accommodate all of us forever. It's not possible. And if it were possible, it certainly wouldn't be desirable. Right? So when we die, it's not something that's done like to us. It's not something that's taken from us. It's this last act of generosity and love for our children and their generation. And parents will do anything for their children. And so if you think in terms of dying, you're dying for your child, and their generation, and for the future of the earth. When you think about it like that, so that they can enjoy this beautiful earth like we did, when you think about it like that, it's not a punishment, right? It's not a loss. It's an honor. It's an obligation and an honor, right? And this is my final act of love for you. I will be going now. Enjoy.
Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't?
No, that was a pretty good conversation. Yeah, thank you.
What's next, and where can everyone find you? And the book is everywhere, for goodness sake. I mean, where can we get the book? Everywhere. So where can we find you, and what's next?
Well, my website is sebastianjunger.com, Junger. You can get my books in bookstores, preferably, or on Amazon or what have you, or off my website. And I don't know what I'm working on next, actually. I got 2 young children. This book was, it depleted me in all kinds of ways. That's going to take a while to sort of recharge. Yeah. Thank you.
It is a must read.
Thank you.
I've sent to like 10 different people.
Oh, thank you so much.
I think it moved me more than it moved you. We can end on that one. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, comment, subscribe, and share. And make sure to let me know what guests you want to see on in the future.